Scenario 1. What are the steps you would follow for each scenario? In this scenario, after parents were informed of the consequence of the behavior of a student, the parents of that particular student came to the school demanding that he be able to play in tonight's game. Well, the first thing that I would do is remind the parents that this is a learning point for their child to make appropriate choices. The decision isn't to single out their child, but in fact, it is based on school policy. The justification for my rationale and how I would go about dealing with this problem. Well, the reason for the policy is to promote a safe learning environment for their child and for others. Without distractions, policy is established to deter students from engaging with inappropriate behaviors. I would refer them to the school board policy, which has the policy and procedures for student discipline. I would also inform the parents that the inappropriate actions do have consequences, and again, they are backed up with the policy and procedures stated in the school handbook, and that this is an opportunity for their child to learn to make appropriate choices. I would also have in front of me the record of the incidents and the occurrence present so that I could refer to it, with all of the documentation from the teacher and myself, as well as having the phone calls home recorded in the documentation. Then I would state there is protocol in the Code of Conduct that's spelled out for how behavior is handled. The Code of Conduct for the school district is based on TEA law, section 37.002, in which it states, if a teacher removes a student from a class under this subsection, a principal may place the student in another appropriate classroom, into in-school suspension, or into a disciplinary alternative education program as provided by section 37.008. The terms of the removal may prohibit the student from attending or participating in school-sponsored or school-related activity. And that's where this particular law comes into effect for this appropriate consequence for the student. He was sent to ISS, therefore he is not allowed to participate in the school sponsored activity, which is the basketball game. Again, the reason for the policy is to promote a safe learning environment for the child and for others. The policy is again established to keep inappropriate behaviors from happening. The decision for the consequence of their child is based off a school board policy, and the decision will stand, it will not change, that their child will not play in the game at that night. I would also point out to the parents that their support in the decision will only strengthen the consequences and hopefully to minimize inappropriate behavior in the future. This would help result in the student-focused learning from the experience, and to have the parents look at this experience not as negative, but as a positive learning opportunity. Without parental support, the student will believe that they did nothing wrong. Then, at the very end, if the parent still would like to talk to the school board or someone, the superintendent, I would give them that information. I would have the school board member's name written down on a card with their contact information so that they can contact them as well with the information that I have given them. All of this is based off of TEA law and the school code of conduct. For scenario 2, what are the steps in which I would use to follow this particular scenario? Well, for this scenario, the main driving force is to preserve a positive climate. This can be difficult when a teacher is resistant or difficult with the policies that are trying to be implemented. A teacher, like Mrs. Guzman, who resists change can be hard to work with and can bring negativity to the school culture. The best way to address this is to first have a one-on-one conversation with the teacher to address the behavior. This should be done by positively framing the situation so that the focus is not negative, which is what we're trying to avoid. So instead of calling Mrs. Guzman out for being negative, I would do something like the following question, or ask something like the following. You and I are both care about the school and the curriculum and the future of the success of this school. And then, so what are the ways in which your words are supportive of the future success of this school. By asking a question like this, it helps the teacher to think about their actions, and hopefully they will come to terms with what's happened rather than me having to point it out. Hopefully the teacher will, throughout the course of them talking through the answer of this question, again, they will come to terms with their actions. And the optimal goal, that is the optimal goal of this whole conversation, is to help bring about a positive reaction instead of negative. Then, after she has talked through, I would paraphrase what she has said to make sure that I did not misinterpret what her answer was. If she doesn't come to the terms on her own, I would help guide her into understanding the impact of her behavior. If the teacher has a hard time coming to terms or coming to the conclusion on her own, or how the negative comments have been perceived, then it's time to direct her instruction to engage her into the outcome of her actions. Information needs to be given to her about the situation in which Mrs. Longoria has overheard Mrs. Guzman complain about the initiative and make untrue statements to the group of other teachers in the hallway. That Mrs. Longoria did herself overhear these comments, and to try to help clarify where these comments are coming from. Mrs. Longoria needs to address each of the comments to clarify the information so that Mrs. Guzman has no question about the facts that where Mrs. Longoria is coming from, and so that Mrs. Longoria can clear up any misunderstanding. Mrs. Longoria also needs to clearly state her facts and where she's coming from with this initiative so that Mrs. Guzman knows all of the details. And then Mrs. Longoria should have Mrs. Guzman paraphrase or repeat back to her what Mrs. Longoria has said, just to make sure that there can be any misconceptions can be cleared up. All of this information is backed up by the TAC code 247.2. Standard 2.2 states that an educator shall not harm others by knowingly making false statements about a colleague or a school system. And in this fact, Mrs. Guzman is making false statements about Mrs. Longoria and the initiative in which Mrs. Longoria is trying to implement. In the conversation as well, I would also have Mrs. Longoria explain to Mrs. Guzman that as she continues down this path, that there will be some sort of disciplinary actions that it will take place due to the false statements that she has been saying about a colleague in the school system. This is having a very negative impact on the initiative, and disciplinary action can occur if this behavior continues. There can be, at the end, a formal write-up if the behavior does not improve. For scenario 3, the steps in which I would take to handle this particular scenario. Well, first of all, for scenario 3, I would refer to TAC code 247.2. Standard 1.2 states, the educator shall not knowingly misappropriate, divert, or use monies, personnel, property, or equipment committed to his or her charge for personal gain or advantage. The very first thing that I would do is what is stated in part of the scenario, investigate. You have to make sure that there is an investigation so that there is documentation and evidence on what has happened, not just base it off a hearsay. When information was brought to Mr. Presswood's attention, and an investigation did begin. The investigation, it was found that Mr. Doobie took over the program which collected money for a school carnival and the Camp Grady Spruce field trip. In the investigation, Mr. Presswood discovered that there is a major discrepancy with what was deposited and what should have been deposited based off of the information that he got from other people. The first deposit, stated by the secretary for the field trip by Mr. Doobie, through the secretary's records, stated that he deposited only $500, but the records estimated that it should have been at least $13,000. A similar issue was found for the school carnival. Records indicated that a deposit of only $500 was made with Mr. Doobie, but is estimated that it should have been approximately $5,000, based off of the attendance records kept by the PTA president, who collected tickets for this event. These discrepancies don't match up with what was actually deposited by Mr. Doobie. In both deposits and both records, I would ask for documentation that was recorded by the secretary and the PTA president. This is evidence that will be used against Mr. Doobie. Once the evidence is compiled, I would inform the superintendent of the situation. Due to TAC Rule 249.14, which deals with disciplinary proceedings, sanctions, and contested cases, it states that certified holder who was terminated from employment and there is evidence that he or she committed any of the following acts: an illegally transferred, appropriated, or expended school property of funds. In this case, it looks as if Mr. Doobie has used funds inappropriately. The evidence is that the money was deposited was not as much as it should have been. And in the investigation, if it is found that he is guilty of this, he can be terminated. The state law also states that if a teacher is found guilty for misappropriating these funds, criminal charges can be held against him for embezzlement. They can lose their job and possibly even their teaching certificate. The teachers wanted to due process, though, and with the investigation, after the evidence is compiled, then a meeting needs to be set with the superintendent and Mr. Doobie so that he is brought in and he can show evidence of his deposits and kind of try to explain what has happened with the money itself. If he cannot bring to light the discrepancies, then he can face disciplinary consequences. I would tell him that in this meeting that I would inform Mr. Doobie that there is a disciplinary discrepancy within the deposits that have been noticed, and then ask him to present his documentation to me. If he is unable to do this, then there will be further steps that will take place. Once he is presented with documentation, I would then show him the evidence of the discrepancy. At this point, if Mr. Doobie, again, cannot prove the discrepancy is false, the teacher will be turned in for embezzlement, and the superintendent and the school will then file charges against him. For scenario 4, I would refer to the TAC code 66.107, local responsibility. This says the Board of Trustees of a school district shall require the employee responsible for ordering instructional materials to complete Texas Educational Agency developed training in the use of technology and instructional materials allotment and the use of instructional materials ordering system known as EMAT. Training shall be completed prior to the ordering instructional materials for the first time, and again at the time the district or charter school is notified by the Texas Education Agency that the training has been updated. The school district or charter shall maintain documentation of the completion of the required training. In this scenario, the superintendent conducted me to conduct a day-to-day operation of the new adoption of instructional material. As a designee, I have allotted amounts for each campus that needs the new math books based on enrollment numbers. I have a budget of $100,000 to spend for my particular campus for instructional materials. The materials voted on and adopted for the math department will cost $70,000. The first thing that I need to do is to make sure that I have the necessary training in order to carry out this task. And this goes back to the TAC 66.107, the local responsibility, to make sure that I have the correct training in order to purchase these materials. If I do have this training, I would then proceed with the next step, which is to look at the enrollment numbers and to make sure that the numbers match the requested amount for the materials voted upon for the math department, which will cost $70,000. If the numbers match for the request, the order will be placed. If there is a discrepancy in the numbers, I would then need to verify the amount needed to order based off of the enrollment. Again, if the numbers match, then I would spend $70,000 on the ordering of the new textbooks. That would leave over $30,000. In this case, FFA has asked for $5,000. The English department, Social department, Science department have each asked for $20,000. The Science department also has asked are stated that they are out of compliance of their safety equipment. As a leader, how do I deal with this? Well, very simple. First of all, as I said before, if the amount is allotted for the $70,000 out of the $100,000 for the new math textbooks, and there is $30,000 left over, well, then I need to look at what is the request with this money that these departments have had. Is it instructional material? And if it is, then the money can be allotted to these new groups. If it has nothing to do with instructional material, then the money cannot go towards these groups. And this is all based off of the TAC code 66.1307, which states the instructional materials allotted may not be used for office supplies, items that are not directly related to student instruction, such as furniture, athletic equipment, extension cords, temporary contractors, or video surveillance equipment. So, when looking at the money that has been requested, I have to look to see if it's dealing with instructional materials. If what has been requested with the money has nothing to do with instructional materials, then that money will be denied for those particular departments. But let's just say that out of the $30,000, that each one of those departments have asked for instructional materials. Well, there's $30,000 left, and there are 4 different groups, which means that each group would get around $5,000. And depending on which group needs a little bit more for instructional materials, they might get a little bit more. For instance, the English department, Social Studies department, and Science department asked for $20,000, but they're only going to get probably $7,000 out of that 20. And that's just to make it a little bit more fair in supplementing all the money with all the different groups. As for the Science department, which states that they are also out of compliance with the safety equipment, this statement would need to be investigated a little bit further to truly see if they are out of compliance. And if they are out of compliance, then I would need to find other monies in the budget to fill this particular request, because the money that has been requested with the instructional materials cannot be spent for updates and making things safe for the department. That comes from another area within the budget. And again, this goes back to the TAC code 661307, which specifies what can be spent with instructional material money.